Welcome everybody. All right, so let's go ahead and let's open up Blender here. Now this is Blender and you can see that there is a bunch, well, there's a little square on the screen. This is what we call the camera. And one thing that you need to know about Blender is if you want to do anything, you use the right mouse button, okay? So let's go ahead and let's go to File New, and this will just simply reload the startup file here, right? Now, one of the things about 3D modeling that you need to understand is how do you move around? Now, what I'm doing here is I'm moving around with the middle mouse button, right? And you can see that I'm just simply moving around here. Now, one thing I should mention is that I actually do use a mouse still. Some people use a trackpad, but I like to use a mouse, and specifically, I actually have a mouse where I operate it with my thumb. The reason is that the other normal mouse, I actually got repetitive stress in, and well, essentially my wrist would just hurt all the time. So if that happens to you, I recommend using one with the mouse here. Now, I actually have quite good dexterity with that mouse, but the other thing that you need to understand, it might take a little bit of time. So the default scene in Blender comes up with three different objects. We have our cube, we have our camera, and we have our light. Now these are the three basic items that you need in a 3D scene to actually make it work. Without these, it doesn't make any sense. You need a camera to view the object, you need a light to illuminate the object, you need the object itself. Now, different kinds of 3D software have different ideas on how they should work and function. Blender has the idea where you start out with a cube and you model it from there. In other 3D programs, what happens is that you start from nothing and you add your primitives as you go along. So there's a couple things that we need to do. So we have our right click to select, we have our middle mouse button to move, and if you put shift and middle mouse, you can kind of move up and down and all around. All right, so let's take a look at this cube here. Now, what you can do is you can move the cube up, you can move the cube to the right, and then you can move the cube to the left here, okay? Now, these are axes, or axes, depending on how you pronounce it, and you have the X, Y, and Z axis. So you can move these along the X, Y, and Z axis, all right? So, we now have a cube here, and let's go ahead and how do we edit it? Obviously, you're not going to be making cubes for the rest of your life, so you need to go and edit it. So the two modes that we have here are object mode and edit mode. Okay, and you can just tab in between the two. So push tab and you can see that you can go to object mode or you can go into edit mode. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this here. Now you can see that a few things are different between the two. First of all, there's these little points and you see these lines and you see things are highlighted. Well, you can go and select, you can select a vertice or a vertex here and you can move it around. And that's essentially how Blender works. You have these vertices, and very soon I'm going to show you what edges and faces are, and you simply move them around to make whatever you want here. Even just by doing something very simple, this kind of looks like a cool building. Now, I'm just going to push Control Z to undo that. And if you want to select more than one item, you can simply push Shift. Okay, so look at that. That kind of looks neat. You got a little ramp of some kind. And that's pretty much all that it is. Okay. Now you can select three different items. You can either select the vertices, you can select the edge, right? And you can see that the edge is being selected now. So sometimes you need to edit the vertices, sometimes you need to edit the edge, and lastly, you can actually edit the face. Okay. I'm just going to undo that, by the way. And I'm going to select the face, and you can kind of move that out as well. Okay. Personally, I like face modeling the best, but that's just me. All right, so we now have this right here. Now, the number one thing that you need to know how to do in Blender here is to extrude. So push E to extrude, and you can see that we now have two kind of boxes here. And you can move this up and down, you can move it around, etc. And if I just kind of move this, you can see that I'm kind of making an arch, right? Just like that. So just push E to extrude, etc. So I'm just going to undo that here. You can also rotate it. You can rotate that, and One thing I should mention is, let's say you do this. You see how the face is kind of intersecting with the other faces? You don't want to have that happen, right? So you can rotate it and you can make some cool little pieces of art if you wish. I think that looks kind of neat. I'm just going to undo that again. So those are the two items you need to do. So we have extrude, we have rotate, and lastly we have scale by pushing S. Okay? And you can see that we now have scale, and that's another one that's really important here. We almost kind of got like a flashlight thing going on. Now on top of that, okay, if I push scale and I push X, you will only scale along the X axis. If you push S and Y, you will only scale along the Y axis. Now another thing you'll notice is that if you constantly move the mouse down, like you can see that the mouse is warping from the top and going back to the bottom. So if you need to scale a lot, you can just do that. It's actually really intuitive. I really enjoy that with Blender here. And lastly, if you want to scale along the Z-axis, well, in this case, the Z-axis is up and down, and it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so essentially, that is what you need to know with Blender here. Now, let's take a look at this transform menu. Now, there's two things you need to understand here. There is the loop cut and the subdivide. Okay, so the loop cut here, if you look at this, you can see that it makes a pink line here. And what that will do is if you click twice, you can see that now we now have two faces on each side. And this is important because we need to know how to loop cut. It's something that's very interesting. You need to do this to add more geometry. So I'm just going to undo that for a second, and then I'm going to go to loop cut again. Now you can loop cut along each axis if you wish, right? You can cut in the middle, on the top, or which side here. Now if you use the middle mouse button, you can make more of these, and you can see that now there's quite a bit more faces. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that as well. The next thing you can do is if you push Control A, okay, or just simply A, you can select everything, and you can also subdivide it, and subdivide it again. And that's another way to create geometry. When you create more faces and vertices and edges like this, that's when you can get more detail. And that's what really happens when you're creating more detail, is creating more of these edges here. Now I'm also going to subdivide it and subdivide it and subdivide it. Now this here is a lot of faces. Now one thing you need to understand, specifically with games, is that if you want to make 3D models for your game, it's going to be quite difficult to add in this much detail. Okay, the more detail you have, the more lag it can possibly produce. So I'm just going to undo that here. Okay, just simply undo that here. And for the most part, that is what we need to do and what you need to know for Blender, at least for low poly modeling. This concludes the tutorial.